Hello everybody, and welcome to our third statewide synchronous session for Introduction to Sociology, SOCI111. If you're listening to this, today we will be covering Chapter 8, which is Deviance, Crime, and Social Control. The issues we're going to be taking a look at: what is deviance? We're going to try and come up with a definition of deviance. What is social control? We'll be defining that and looking at mechanisms of social control. Law and society, examining laws as a form of social control. We'll examine our sociological perspectives on deviance, interactionist, feminist, conflict, and functionalist. Take a look at crime, different types of crime. We'll be examining the death penalty in the United States and worldwide as part of our social policy and social control. Specific questions we'll be answering: what is deviance and what are its consequences? What causes crime? How does society control people's behaviors, convincing us to conform to both unwritten rules and formal laws? So, what is deviance? Behavior that violates the standards or conduct or expectations of a group or society. And essentially anything outside what would be called our social norms. If you remember that, norms guide behavior, determine what is acceptable behavior. Deviance is any behavior outside the social norms. Involves violation of group norms, which may or may not be formalized into law. For example, we have a law against murder, we have a law against speeding, both of which are norms of behavior. Don't murder and don't speed. Those are norms, what normal people, what society would determine as acceptable behavior. However, people are not expected to pick their nose in public either. There is no law about that. But group norms, of course, exist within a particular society and at a particular time. So we're looking at what a particular society defines as norms of behavior. In the United States of America, of course, the three norms that I talked about are all norms of behavior here. So, deviance, one of the ways that deviance is reduced or prohibited is through social stigma. Irving Goffman did a lot of work on stigma. He was looking specifically at people with mental illnesses and how that's a stigmatized condition. But essentially, stigma is a devalued label applied to members of certain social groups. Criminal, rapist, pedophile. These would all be examples of deviant behavior, behavior that society frowns upon, that have labels attached to them and that become stigmatized statuses. We can also examine deviance in the idea of technology. Technological innovations can redefine social interactions and standards of behavior related to them. Many people from older age cohorts feel like the younger age cohorts are getting increasingly rude in their face-to-face interactions. However, if we look at a certain technological innovation that has occurred, we can see that it's not necessarily being rude. It is behaviors being changed according to technology. It's not necessarily that younger generations are getting rude. It's that younger generations begin framing communication in terms of 140 or 180 character bytes of information, essentially like sound bites. Please, thank you, all the niceties of communication become extraneous because you're trying to figure out the shortest way possible to communicate your message so that you can send it in one text or one instant message without having your phone automatically send half of a message off. So here we see a technological innovation reshaping behavior, redefining social interaction and standards of behavior related to them. Instead of observing all the forms of politeness, we are shaping communication because of brevity rather than politeness. Social control. I said, well, look at what that is. These are the mechanisms, techniques, and strategies employed for preventing deviant human behavior in any society. Societies have social control as a way of regulating behavior. Some of the ways that we learn about what's acceptable behavior are through socialization. Parents, peer groups, schools, companies, government, all of these things, to a certain extent, socialize us. They also tell us what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior. So they all have. Parents will punish unacceptable behavior, and they will reward acceptable behavior. Same thing with your peer group. Schools. I often comment in my face-to-face classes that on the first day of class, I don't have to tell all my students, sit down, be quiet while I'm speaking. If you have a question, raise your hand. I don't have to go over the rules of basic classroom conduct because that's already been socialized into them in prior experiences within education. But even I'm being controlled in the classroom. We have roles that define inappropriate and appropriate behavior for both students and for instructors. Companies, employee handbook. How many times have you had an employee handbook handed to you? And the government, of course, through formal laws, legislation. Okay. One of the ways that all of these things, parents, peer group, schools, companies, and government, enact social control is through the use of sanctions. Sanctions are penalties and rewards for conduct concerning a social norm. We may get rewarded for good behavior and penalized for bad behavior. So even though when we hear it in the news, often sanctions are associated with negative behavior, and we think of sanctions only as punishments, sanction is value neutral. It can be either a penalty or a reward. If you look at this, it says people often 161 receive competing messages about how to behave. I would say we should probably eliminate the 161 out of there. I'm pretty sure that's a typo. I haven't contacted my sales rep to find out about it, but people often receive competing messages about how to behave. This is true. Parents may be trying to say one thing about behavior. Peer group may be saying something else. Parents will usually agree with schools and government about how to behave, but oftentimes peer group and companies may expect different behavior than government, parents, and school. Functionalists believe that people must respect social norms if any group or society is to survive. If we do not have a basic understanding of how to act, society becomes impossible because social interaction is governed by nothing. Think about it this way. Essentially, the informal social norms that tell us how to interact with each other on a day-to-day basis provide the foundation upon which formal social norms, laws, rest. Police are able to control behavior. They're able to arrest offenders because the majority of people obey laws. Let's just think about traffic laws as one example. Driving down a highway, if only one or two people are speeding, the police have no problem pulling them over and sanctioning them with a penalty. If everybody is doing 90 to 100 miles an hour, the police cannot enact social control over that many people. Anybody who might have driven in Chicago during rush hour knows that when you're on the Dan Ryan, unless it's backed up, the speed limit is rarely observed. People go between 70 and 90 miles an hour in the 55 to 70 mile an hour zones on a regular basis. And because there's so many people doing it, oftentimes the police just ignore that particular violation. because they simply cannot enact sanctions against every single violator. So when we look at the idea of social control, formal social control, our legal system, rests upon the foundation of informal social control, the way that we're socialized into belief that we should obey laws. Conflict theorists look at it a little bit differently. They believe that the elites use laws to protect the interests of themselves. The powerful in society determine what deviant behavior is, and they define deviant behavior in a way that protects their interests. So successful function of a society consistently benefits powerful and disadvantages other groups in society. Conformity. Group conformity, conformity to norms. It's going along with peers who have no special right to direct behavior. Obedience is compliance with higher authorities in a hierarchical structure. That's the difference between conformity and obedience, and there have been researchers who have done experiments on both conformity and obedience. Solomon Asch was one person who researched group conformity and how people will tend to go along with the group. Stanley Milgram, of course, had his famous obedience experiments. And that should be the Milgram experiment, not the Mailgram experiment. The experimenter instructed people to administer increasingly painful electric shocks to a subject. Even when they heard the victim supposedly crying out in pain and then even stop crying out, and many of them may have believed that they shocked the person either into unconsciousness or beyond, when people were told continue administering shocks, almost two-thirds of the participants, because they were being told by an authority figure in a white coat to do it, continued administering the shocks. They may have asked questions like, should I continue? I hear the person screaming in there. But when the supposed doctor said, yes, go ahead, administer it, two-thirds of us went ahead and administered it. There are videos in the class session for this week. I think it's 3 videos where you can actually watch this experiment play out. As we said, informal and formal social control. Informal social control used to casually enforce norms. Formal social control, laws where police are enforcing the laws. Informal social control can actually undermine formal social control. As I said, if we do not all believe that for the most part we should obey laws, enforcing laws becomes impossible. Durkheim believed that if you wanted to know what was really important to a society, look at their system of jurisprudence, because this is what is important enough to have enacted formal laws with formal sanctions attached to them. Now, you may be thinking, well, but some of the laws seem ridiculous. That may be true. However, what Durkheim was talking about is that laws that are important to the social cohesion of a society, important to the social interaction of a society. Some traffic laws may seem pretty trivial, but if everybody ignores those traffic laws, does travel on streets become impossible? Quite possibly. So, the norms of behavior that are important for social function, for society continuing to be able to function, are the ones that those are the norms that are formalized into laws. Law, of course, government social control. The legal order reflects values of those in a position to exercise authority. That a little bit more conflict right there. For example, the reason that we have certain drugs outlawed is because of the influence of a few powerful individuals within the government who believe that these drugs should be outlawed. Control theory is the idea that our connection to members of society leads us to systematically conform to society's norms. We're being controlled because we're connected, because of social cohesion. So when we think about a particular issue, binge drinking, why do most college students regard binge drinking as a normal rather than a deviant behavior? And which do you think would be more effective in stopping binge drinking on your campus? Informal or formal social control? When we think about something like this, let's just examine it. Why do college students regard binge drinking as normal behavior? It's part of a lot of sports rituals, becoming a member of fraternity, sorority, hazing rituals, becoming a member of a sports team. And in general, college is a time when a lot of individuals, for the first time in their life, are away from their parents and free to exercise less restraint on their behaviors. So people tend to go a little wild. And so a lot of people tend to binge drink. So if we talk about college students regarding binge drinking as normal rather than deviant behavior, that simply reflects the fact that more college students go on binges of drinking than don't. And of course, informal social control would probably be more effective in stopping binge drinking than formal social control. We actually got college students to believe that binge drinking should be deviant behavior, that it's not something that should be done. It would be much more effective at stopping it than writing laws prohibiting binge drinking. Okay, right now there's a huge debate over marijuana as to whether or not it should be legal. Medical marijuana is one way states are trying to legalize it. Okay? And if we look right here on this chart, NORMAL, by the way, is the National Organization for Reform of Marijuana Laws. It's a nationwide agency that is seeking, at a minimum, to decriminalize it, to make it a non-criminal offense to have marijuana. But if we look, we right now are up to 15 states and the District of Columbia that allow the cultivation of medical marijuana and protect patients who possess medical marijuana from criminal penalties. 15 states have laws that recognize marijuana's medical value, but these laws are ineffective because they rely on federal cooperation. I believe right now Illinois is actually on the verge of changing and becoming the 16th to actually have laws protecting people from prosecution if they have a doctor's note allowing them to use medical marijuana. And of course 19 states have no provisions for marijuana at all, for medical marijuana at all. In fact, if we look at Washington and Colorado, they have actually gone right out and made marijuana legal for recreational use. It's no longer just medical marijuana there. It's actually recreational use as well. Maryland protects medical marijuana patients from jail, but not from the threat of arrest, and I believe they can still be fined there. So right now, our society is engaged in a bit of a culture war over this particular issue. You can see there is a variety of different approaches taken by states here. At a federal level, it is still classified as an illegal substance. Okay. Durkheim looked at deviance as actually necessary and a functional part of social cohesion and social stability. Because in the act of deviance, one of the things it does is it reaffirms exactly where the boundary is of normal behavior. As a community comes together to sanction deviant behavior in an individual, it reaffirms the solidarity of that community as well. So deviance actually provides function and contributes to social stability. So punishments established within a culture help define acceptable behavior and contribute to stability. Erickson illustrated boundary maintenance function of deviance. When we come together and say that's bad behavior, we're reaffirming where the boundaries are. And we are actually contributing to the maintenance of those boundaries of normal behavior. Of course, we've discussed anomie, or you've read about it in previous chapters. When social control of individual behavior has become ineffective, individuals feel a loss of direction. Durkheim called this anomie. Durkheim actually did a lot of work on how anomie can lead to suicide. One of his books was called Suicide, and in it Durkheim looked at the ideas of social cohesion, social control, really the social component of the act of suicide. Durkheim first thing he did was divide suicide into 4 different types. There's egoistic suicide, altruistic suicide, anomic suicide, and fatalistic suicide. They all result from varying degrees of connection or control. Egoistic suicide is when an individual is not very well connected into society. Examples of egoistic suicide are the person who commits suicide and leaves a suicide note saying that they were sorry they were a burden on everybody around them. Altruistic suicide is where people are very connected into the group and feel that the group is more important than themselves as individuals. Kamikaze pilots would be an example of that. Fatalistic suicide is suicide that occurs when individuals are over-controlled and over-regulated by society. In the former Soviet Union, where people had no individual freedoms and there was a high suicide rate, that would have been fatalistic suicide. People commit suicide in that case because no matter what they do, there's no way that they can actually have any effect or make any change in their lives. And anomic suicide is the suicide that results when people feel no regulation, no control coming from social institutions. Durkheim was looking at 19th century France suicide rates, and anybody who knows their French history knows that in the 19th century it was one almost century-long period of continuous economic and political upheaval. So politics and the economy as 2 social institutions were not providing social control or social regulation for individuals. Durkheim believed that religion can step in and fill that void, but there's a huge difference between the Catholic religion and the Protestant religion in the way that they're practiced. The Protestant religion tends to be more individualistic and will provide less social regulation and less social control, so we would see higher suicide rates in Protestant provinces than we would in Catholic provinces in France during the 19th century. This was the evidence that Durkheim found that supported his ideas on anomic suicide. Merton has his anomie theory of deviance or strain theory of deviance. This is another functionalist approach. People adapt in certain ways by conforming to or by deviating from cultural expectations. Merton had this idea that there are acceptable goals in a society and acceptable means to achieve those goals. For example, in the United States of America, an acceptable goal is the accumulation of material wealth and possessions. It's called living the good life, right? And the acceptable means for achieving that goal, hard work and education. A person who accepts both of these goals, works hard, goes to college, gets an education, gets a job, works hard at the job, and eventually winds up owning a nice house with 2 cars, has the 2.4 kids, the white picket fence, all that kind of stuff, a nice retirement account, is what Merton would call a conformist. An innovator is somebody who accepts the goals of a society, like, yeah, I want to get rich, but you know what? I don't want to work hard and I don't want to go to school, so I'm going to come up with a new, different way of doing that. For Merton, a criminal is actually an innovator, somebody who rejects the means to achieve a goal but accepts the goal of society. White-collar crime, street crime, what kind of crime you have, certain types of crime would be considered innovation by Merton. Not necessarily crimes of need where people are starving and they're just robbing in order to feed themselves, but say corporate crime where the officers enrich themselves even further by defrauding the employees out of their retirement fund, as the case of Enron.com and Kenneth Lay, who was actually convicted of that. This is what Merton would call an innovator. A ritualist is somebody who accepts the means, education and hard work, but rejects the goal of the acquisition of material wealth. In a certain sense, I could be considered a ritualist because I have gone to school for an extended period of time. I'm not saying that I'm starving by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm never going to get rich working for Ivy Tech as a faculty member. I'll make a comfortable living, but I'm not going to have the mansion and the 2 cars and all that kind of stuff. So ritualism is when people accept the means, education and hard work, but reject the goal, the acquisition of material wealth. And then there are retreatists. And retreating from society is rejecting both the means and the goals of society. People who live in the mountains, like hermits, could be considered retreatists. People living in communes in Oregon could be considered retreatists. Beyond retreatism, there's also rebellion. And rebellion is when not only do you reject the means and goals of society, but you substitute new means and new goals. Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, Mao Zedong, Joseph Stalin, these are all people who became rebels. They rejected the way that their society was structured, what was the acceptable goal and acceptable means to achieve that goal, and they tried to substitute, and in some cases succeeded in substituting something different in there. So we have the interactionist perspective as well, moving on from functionalism to interactionism, this idea of cultural transmission theory. Cultural transmission is essentially humans learn how to behave in social situations, whether properly or improperly, depending on the interactions to which they are exposed. If we think about differential association, if anybody's ever seen the movie New Jack City, where Wesley Snipes has all the money, all the power in New Jack City, for the reason that he has resorted to criminal behavior, dealing crack, and is viewed favorably by a lot of the residents of the neighborhood because he's achieved the goals, but in a different way. So differential association is the process through which exposure to attitudes favorable to criminal acts leads to the violation of rules. This is also the idea that if you grow up in a neighborhood where there are gangs, and you see favorable attitudes from your friends towards being a gang member, you may join in that type of activity. Social disorganization theory looks a little different. It's the absence or breakdown of communal relationships and social institutions that leads to increases in crime and deviance. But some claim social disorganization theory seems to blame the victim. It's not necessarily the criminal's fault that they commit crimes because there's no kind of civicness in their community. There's no communal relationship with each other. Social institutions, the economy may have failed them because, or education may have failed them. Labeling theory. Why do people who may commit the same crime get labeled differently? Some people are viewed as deviants while others are not. We were discussing the ideas of medical marijuana. If we think back, before the medical marijuana movement, smoking marijuana was a crime. Not everybody who smoked marijuana was labeled as a criminal. Some people were, but some people weren't. Some people claimed there were class-based differences in the approach to this. Some people claimed there were race and ethnicity played into this as well. But for whatever reason, some people were viewed as criminals and others were not. Why were some labeled deviants when others were not? So it's how society reacts to acts of deviance in individuals that leads to people being labeled deviants. Response to an act, not the act itself or the behavior. Response to a behavior, not the behavior, determines deviance. Labeling, and when we talk about agents of social control, remember we're talking about parents, peer group, school, companies, and the government. When we think about labeling, talking about racial profiling, people are identified as criminal suspects purely on the basis of their race. This has been an issue in a number of things going on. In New York, there was the stop and frisk program in which police were free to stop suspicious characters and frisk them. Research revealed that 90% of the people stopped under that program were either African American or Hispanic teenage males. It's an example of racial profiling. Arizona's SB 1070, which was referred to as the racial profiling law, said that if police were interacting with somebody who was a suspect and they believed that that suspect had any degree of Latino heritage, they were then required to make that person establish citizenship. So, for example, I used to live in Arizona. If I was pulled over for a traffic ticket, I would be given the ticket and that would be it, right? I would either be given the ticket or not. If a Latino or Hispanic person was pulled over and they had a name that sounded Latino or Hispanic, or they had darker skin, darker eyes than I do, darker hair than I do, they would be required to establish citizenship, not just be ticketed or not ticketed. So that's racial profiling. The additional security searches conducted by the TSA in the initial years following 9/11, if you had an Arabic appearance or a name that sounded Arabic or Islamic, you had a greater probability of being selected for one of those additional random security checks. 90% of the people selected for the random security checks either appeared Arabic or had an Arabic or Islamic sounding name, something like Muhammad or Hussein, something like that. Popularity of labeling theory is reflected in the emergence of a related perspective. Social constructionist, the idea behind social constructionism is essentially that together, through shared interactions, we collectively construct our social reality. So deviance is a product of the culture we live in. What is defined as deviant behavior is defined by each society through collective interaction. It focuses on the decision that creates the deviant identity. So what is sexual deviance? Depends upon what society you're talking about. Definition of deviant sexual behavior varies significantly over time and from culture to culture. At one point in time, the English defined oral sex as deviant behavior because it was something that the French did in the period before the age of colonization and exploration. The English believed that that was deviant sexual behavior. Use of terms, even in a positive way, still implies human sexuality can be confined in neat, exclusive categories. For a lot of people, homosexuality and homosexual acts are deviant sexual behavior. But what is defined as sexual deviance does change across time, and it does seem to change with each generation as well. Okay, now we get to conflict theory. People with power protect their own interests and define deviance to suit their needs. Why do you think we see violent crime instead of corporate crime more frequently in the news? According to conflict theory, it's because Violent crime is crime committed, or what we would call street crime is crime committed by people from lower classes. Corporate crime is committed by the elites. So, social control is exercised differently over different groups: class-based, race-based, ethnicity-based, gender-based. Although gender-based, we'll be looking more in detail at that when we get to feminist theory. And this is where we get to that. Existing approaches to deviance and crime developed with men in mind. So society tends to treat women in stereotypical fashion. A lot of the shows we watch, like about criminal profiling, those profiles tend to reflect male archetypes rather than female archetypes. Cultural views and attitudes towards women influence how they are perceived and labeled. Women are not viewed, although this is beginning to change, women are not viewed, if we think about something like domestic violence, women are not really viewed as perpetrators of domestic violence for the most part. Men are viewed more as the perpetrators of domestic violence than women are. And that's not to say that it isn't perpetrated by women. I'm just saying when most people talk about domestic violence, the mind runs to men abusing women. And that's part of our culturalization, our socialization in our culture. Okay, taking a look again at another research today. Does crime pay? Do you know anyone who has stolen out of need? And when I say out of need, that's stealing to feed yourself or to feed your family. A lot of times when people do that, they will justify it by saying something like, well, you know, I was at work, I'm hungry, so I grabbed something food and ate it. Like if I work at McDonald's, I grabbed something and ate it real quick. They're making billions of dollars and they can't even pay me a decent wage. That's one way we may try to alleviate feelings of guilt and feel justified in the theft. How long does it go on? Usually until they get caught. Okay, profit, difference between revenues and costs, right? When we think about the illegal drug trade, what is it costing society? From a functionalist perspective, if we kind of think about that, it reduces the functionality of individuals if they are constantly using drugs. It diverts resources where they can be applied elsewhere because the police are constantly having to fight the drug war, and we spend billions of dollars every year combating illegal drugs. So the social costs, well, people who become addicts can have their lives shattered. They can wind up losing everything. They can wind up losing their home, losing their family, losing their jobs. It can have some pretty devastating costs. All right, this really looking here, this is Merton's strain theory or anomic theory of deviance. So, non-deviant conformity, and then we have innovation, ritualism, retreatism, and rebellion. This is in your textbook in chapter 8. So, I'm not going to go over it. I've already kind of gone over this. So, this is taking a look at those different approaches. We were discussing the anomie approach, which was functionalist, cultural transmission or differential association, social disorganization, and labeling or social constructionist, which are all kind of interactionist, conflict, and then feminist, which kind of comes out of the conflict theory. Crime is a particular type of deviance. Crime is deviance that has a formal sanction, a formal written sanction attached to it. It's violation of criminal law for which some governmental authority applies formal penalties. Index crimes, these are the crimes that the FBI uses as an index of the level of criminality in our country. Murder, rape, robbery, and assault. These are the 4 index crimes called crimes against the person. These involve crimes where you're directly involved with another individual. Crimes against property include burglary, theft, motor vehicle theft, and arson. Those are what are referred to as crimes against the property. And the difference between crimes against the person and crimes against the property is whether or not the crime is being committed directly against another person or a person's property. That's why robbery, which differs from burglary, burglary is done when the person is not at home. Robbery is when you take stuff from a person. That's why robbery is defined as a crime against the person and not crime against the property. Sociologists look at this a little differently. They classify crimes in terms of how they are committed and how society views the offenses. Victimless crimes. These are crimes in which both participants seem to be willing participants. Dealing drugs, prostitution, gambling are examples of what might be called victimless crimes. Professional crime, this is what you see in organizations that have a hierarchical structure but commit crimes. Godfather, is an example of that, what people refer to as the mafia. That's professional crime. It's kind of organized crime. There is a slight distinction, like a cat burglar, that will be professional crime as well. But professional crime and organized crime are people who essentially specialize in committing crimes, and that's their business, as it were. White collar and technology-based crime. This is crime where people with professional status commit crimes against companies and individuals. Corporate crime differs a little bit from white collar crime in that corporate crime is white collar crime committed by officers of a corporation. Transnational crime, crime that crosses boundaries. As I said, victimless crimes, willing exchange among adults of widely desired but illegal goods and services, sex, drugs, gambling. Not everywhere in the country are these criminal, but in general, those are what victimless crimes would be in the U.S. People making a career of illegal activities is professional crime. A person who pursues crime as a day-to-day occupation, as I said, like a cat burglar or just anybody who makes crime their career. Organized crime, running numbers, dealing drugs, a lot of this can be done by organized crime, group that regulates relations between criminal enterprises involved in illegal activities. They dominate illegal businesses, and sometimes they serve as means of upward mobility for groups of people struggling to escape poverty. Like I said, that's exemplified in New Jack City, in which the people that go to work for Wesley Snipes actually wind up having money and power. White collar and technology-based crime, white collar crime, crime committed by professionals in the context of their professions. Corporate crime is a special type of that. We have computer crime, use of high technology to carry out embezzlement or electronic fraud. Another definition of corporate crime is any act by a corporation that is punishable by the government. Did BP commit corporate crime? The government kind of said yes when they fined them. Hate crimes. Crimes motivated by group affiliation rather than individual characteristics. The offenders are motivated to choose a victim based on race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, disability status, age, and any kind of personal characteristic of a group affiliation. Hatred prompted the offender to commit the crime. In 2010, there were more than 8,300 hate crimes reported. The problem is some crimes are not defined as hate crimes, but really they are. They should be. For example, rape should be considered a hate crime, but the majority are committed by members of the dominant group against relatively powerless. Perfect example of hate crime following the Civil War would have been lynching. Groups like the KKK, which were groups of dominant group members, lynching minority group members. Transnational crime, any type of crime that occurs across multiple national borders. Slavery, of course, which has been and continues to be a problem. Human trafficking continues to be a problem in the world. Young people are being kidnapped and forced into slavery, sometimes sexual slavery, but sometimes just slavery itself. Bilateral cooperation between governments in the pursuit of border criminals is common. The U.S. is trying to work with the Mexican government to rein in what's been going on with the drug cartels in the northern part of Mexico. But international crime spans the globe. Okay, going back to the idea of your campus, and it's hard to kind of think about this because Ivy Tech is a commuter college. They have security, but not necessarily police. A lot of colleges have their own police force. If you go to the University of Arizona, or Purdue, Notre Dame here in Indiana, have their own campus police. So you can look up, Ivy Tech does report on criminal activity that happens on the campuses. Honestly, it's fairly low compared to some other campuses, some other schools. You can find this stuff on Ivy Tech. One of the things they have done to discourage campus crime is, especially violent crime, is anybody is free to request a security guard walk them out to their car at any time they feel nervous about doing that, like in the evening. Okay, pie chart looking at hate crimes here. As I said, beyond race and ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, disability. This is from the Department of Justice. Race accounts for the majority of hate crimes, followed by religion and then sexual orientation. A lot of the hate crimes being committed against people because of religion are when people are Muslim or Islam or are just perceived to be that way. In New York not too long ago, there was actually a member of the Sikh, S-I-K-H religion, which is a religion in India. They're the ones that wear the turbans and grow long beards, that was beaten because it was perceived that he was a Muslim. But that would have been a religious hate crime. Transnational crime, as you can see, beyond the regular crimes like skyjacking, sea piracy, terrorism, trafficking in body parts and trafficking in human beings. There's a lot of them on this list. Reported crime is actually very high in the U.S., so the public regards crime as a major social problem. Interestingly, though, right now, crime rates are on the decline, even as our prison population continues to expand. I believe we're somewhere between 2.2 and 2.5 million prisoners. We're approaching 1% incarceration rate in the U.S., which is much higher than any other high-income industrialized nation. And this despite the fact that, according to the FBI index crimes, reported rates in the U.S. are lowest in about 40 years. Now, this only does track crimes reported to law agencies, which is a little bit different than what you would call a victimization survey. It's a survey of ordinary people to determine whether they have been victims of crime at some point in time. Not every crime that gets committed gets reported to law agencies. International crime rates. We do have more violent crime here in the U.S. This continues to be true. You also see rapid escalation in homicide rates in developing countries supplying drugs to industrialized countries. Think about what's going on with the cartels and the violence in Mexico right now. All you have to do is read about it in the paper. It's not a good time to be visiting Nogales, Agua Prieta, Juarez, any of the border towns, Tijuana. If you're going to go to Mexico, it's actually safer to go deeper into Mexico, to go down to Acapulco, Yucatan Peninsula, Guaymas, further in where the cartels are not trying to get drugs across the border. Here are those index crimes I was talking about. You can see overall there has been a decline since 1999. But despite this, our prison population has rapidly grown since the 1990s. Victimization rate survey right here. Much, much lower than it was in 1980. 3 times is 1/3 of what it was in 1980. Death penalty. The death penalty has been used widely across time. Execution has been a significant form of punishment for deviance from social norms and for criminal behavior for thousands of years, essentially. There is an assumption here that capital punishment is morally and religiously correct to do. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and a life for a life, right? It says it right in the Old Testament. However, the U.S. is one of the only, if not the only, high-income industrialized nation that still uses capital punishment. As of late 2010, 95 other nations, most of them high-income industrialized nations, had renounced capital punishment. The reason I say most of them is there are only roughly what would be 74 of the world's nations that are considered high-income industrialized nations. And I believe the U.S. is the only one that still uses capital punishment. Now, supporters of capital punishment insist that, according to deterrence theory, if we attach severe penalties to certain types of crimes, it will prevent at least some criminals from committing serious offenses. So, fear of execution keeps people from doing certain types of crime. Social inequality puts poor people at a disadvantage in the justice system. Think about what George Ryan did before he left office. I want to say it was around 2005 or so, where he commuted all the death penalties of prisoners awaiting execution in Illinois. A lot of this had to do because there were allegations that confessions were tortured out of a lot of minority lower-class citizens. DNA had exonerated about 4 people. And so there were some serious questions about how prosecutions were going about, or how confessions were being obtained. And so this unfairly falls on poor people. Racial discrimination played into that a little bit as well. Many people, when we talk about like actually endorsing the death penalty, it sounds a little bloodthirsty. So most people shy away from doing that. But most people also in the U.S., I want to say about 65% of people want the death penalty to be available for certain types of crimes, like John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, serial rapists, things like that. In our society, there are about 110 death sentences handed down in trial each year, and there's more than 17,000 reported murders each year. Internationally, of course, we look at China and Iran, two industrializing nations. Executions are much more common there than they are here in the U.S. And this varies state by state because not every state has capital punishment in the U.S. Texas, for example, has capital punishment and really uses it. They have done 3 times more than any other state as far as capital punishments per year. As you can see, Texas, that's what I'm saying, 466. If you look, so 4 times more. Because the next closest, really, if we look at it, is Virginia at 108. So, yeah, Texas is really a lot of executions. Death penalty status by country. As you look, as I said, look at Europe, look at Canada, some countries in South America, countries in Africa, Australia, New Zealand, have all eliminated the death penalty. The U.S. death penalty in use. We are similar really only to China and some other developing nations. But no other high-income developed nation is using the death penalty. Even in Russia, death penalty is used under very limited circumstances. Okay, so that concludes our discussion of Chapter 8. In our next session, which will occur at the same time next week, it'll be 1:30 Central Time, 2:30 Eastern Time. Feel free to tune in if you'd like. We will be discussing chapters 9 and 10 of the textbook. Everybody have a good week.